Sometimes the biggest debt in the world is owed for something money can never buy. Every Thursday at exactly 7:15 p.m., a black Rolls-Royce pulled quietly to the curb outside Willow and Ash, a cozy restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop in downtown Boston. The man who stepped out never arrived with an entourage, never asked for special treatment, and never stayed longer than 45 minutes. Ethan Harrison, a billionaire whose name appeared regularly on magazine covers and financial news, always ordered the same meal: grilled Atlantic salmon, roasted asparagus, sparkling water with lemon, and black coffee before leaving. He spoke softly, thanked everyone who served him, and left the table exactly as neat as he had found it. Yet there was one thing that never failed to leave the restaurant buzzing long after he walked out the front door: his tip. One week it was $2,000. The next it was $5,000. Once, on a rainy November evening, it was $10,000 on an $84 check. Every server dreamed of being assigned to his table, but for reasons no one understood, Ethan always requested the same waitress: Claire Bennett. She was 29, with light brown hair usually tied into a simple ponytail and calm blue eyes that rarely revealed what she was thinking. She wasn't the fastest server in the dining room or the loudest personality among the staff. She simply listened carefully, remembered every customer's preferences, and treated the college student ordering soup with the same quiet respect she gave the executives discussing million-dollar mergers. She accepted every oversized tip with the same polite smile, thanked Ethan sincerely, and tucked the receipt into her apron without excitement. At the end of every shift, she quietly handed most of the money to the restaurant manager and asked that it be placed into the employee emergency fund or divided among the kitchen staff. Nobody knew she did it because she never mentioned it. Rumors, however, spread much faster than facts. Some believed Ethan had fallen in love with her. Others insisted she must have saved his life years ago. A few whispered that she was secretly connected to his company. Claire ignored every theory. She continued refilling coffee cups, carrying heavy trays, and greeting every guest exactly the same way she always had. Still, every Thursday the impossible repeated itself. Ethan would finish his coffee, leave another extraordinary tip, nod politely, and disappear into the Boston evening before anyone could ask a single question. Then, on the first Thursday of December, as snow drifted softly past the restaurant windows and holiday lights reflected across the sidewalk, Ethan placed another thick envelope beneath the check, buttoned his charcoal overcoat, and headed toward the exit. Claire noticed the envelope before clearing the table. Her hands paused. She didn't even need to open it to know there were thousands of dollars inside again. This time, instead of quietly accepting it, she picked up the envelope, hurried across the dining room, and stepped outside into the cold air just before Ethan reached his waiting car. "Mr. Harrison," she called gently. He turned, surprised for the first time in months. Claire held the envelope carefully with both hands, her expression steady, neither grateful nor offended, only genuinely puzzled. "May I ask you something?" she said. Ethan nodded. The city seemed to fall strangely quiet around them. Claire looked directly into his eyes and asked the one question no amount of money had ever been able to answer. "Why me?" Snowflakes drifted silently between the streetlights as Claire lowered her hand, still holding the unopened envelope. Ethan studied her face for several long seconds, almost as though he had expected every possible reaction except this one. Most people would have thanked him. Some would have asked for more. Others might have assumed there was a hidden condition waiting to be revealed. Claire had done none of those things. She simply wanted the truth. Ethan glanced toward the restaurant window where warm golden light spilled onto the sidewalk. Diners laughed over dessert. Glasses clinked softly. Life inside continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "You should keep it," he said quietly. Claire shook her head. "That is not what I asked." Her voice carried no anger, no accusation, only calm sincerity. "If I have done something to earn your kindness, I would like to know what it was." Ethan looked down at the envelope in her hands before slipping both of his own hands into the pockets of his overcoat. The cold December wind tugged gently at his scarf, but he barely seemed to notice. "Do you always question good fortune?" he asked. Claire smiled faintly. "No, I question things that do not make sense." She paused before adding, "Money solves bills. It does not answer questions." For the first time since she had known him, Ethan laughed softly. It was not the confident laugh of a billionaire accustomed to closing impossible deals. It sounded almost relieved. "You are exactly the same," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Claire frowned slightly. "I am sorry." Ethan looked at her again, but whatever memory had surfaced behind his eyes remained hidden. Nothing. Another quiet silence settled between them. Across the street, a city bus rolled past, its headlights reflecting across the fresh snow. A young couple hurried by carrying shopping bags while an elderly man adjusted the collar of his coat against the wind. Boston continued moving, unaware that two strangers were standing only a few feet apart, connected by a story only one of them remembered. Claire extended the envelope toward him once more. "Please take this back until you tell me why." Ethan did not reach for it. "What if I told you it was never about the money?" Claire searched his expression, hoping to find some clue. There was no arrogance there. No amusement. Only a quiet sadness that seemed strangely out of place on someone the world described as one of the most successful businessmen in America. "Then what is it about?" she asked. Ethan opened his mouth as if the answer had already formed, but the vibration of his phone interrupted him. He glanced at the screen. His driver had arrived beside the curb, and several messages from his executive assistant continued lighting up the display. He silenced the phone without reading them. For a man whose schedule was planned months in advance, ignoring those messages should have been impossible. Yet he did it without hesitation. "Not tonight," he said gently. "This story deserves more than 5 minutes on a sidewalk." Claire lowered the envelope, but did not relax her grip. "Will you actually tell me?" Ethan nodded once. "Next Thursday. Sit with me after your shift. I will answer every question you have." He turned toward the waiting car before stopping one final time. Without looking back, he spoke so quietly that Claire almost wondered if she had imagined the words. "You changed my life once, Claire. The only difference is, you never realized you did." The following week seemed unusually long to Claire. Every morning she woke before sunrise, walked the familiar 4 blocks from her apartment to the subway station, and wondered whether she had imagined the conversation outside the restaurant. Life itself, however, refused to slow down. Lunch crowds filled Willow and Ash with office workers escaping their desks. Evenings brought families celebrating birthdays, couples sharing quiet dinners, and tourists searching for authentic New England seafood. Claire welcomed each guest with the same warm smile she had always worn, yet a single question lingered quietly behind every conversation. What could she possibly have done to change the life of a man she did not remember ever meeting? Her coworkers noticed the difference immediately. "You have been distracted all week," said Megan, another waitress, while polishing wine glasses before dinner service. Claire smiled politely. "Just thinking." Megan lowered her voice. "About Mr. Harrison?" Claire did not answer, and that silence was answer enough. Rumors had only grown stronger since Ethan's latest visit. Some employees joked that a proposal was coming. Others believed Claire would soon leave the restaurant for an executive position at one of Ethan's companies. Even the restaurant manager, Daniel Brooks, pulled her aside one afternoon. "I hope you know," he said gently, "whatever is happening, nobody here thinks any differently of you." Claire appreciated the kindness, but simply nodded. "Nothing is happening." Daniel studied her expression for a moment before smiling. "That is exactly why everyone respects you." Thursday finally arrived beneath a pale winter sky. By 6 o'clock, candles flickered across every table, soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers, and the scent of fresh rosemary and warm bread filled the dining room. Claire found herself glancing toward the front windows more often than she wanted to admit. At exactly 7:15 p.m., headlights reflected across the polished floor. The familiar black Rolls-Royce stopped at the curb. Ethan stepped out wearing the same charcoal overcoat, carrying no briefcase, no laptop, and no visible sign that he had spent the day leading a multi-billion-dollar company. He entered the restaurant with his usual quiet confidence, greeting the hostess by name before walking toward his regular table near the front window. Claire approached with a menu, even though both of them knew he would not need one. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison," she said. Ethan smiled softly. "Good evening, Claire." There was something different in his voice. It sounded lighter, almost peaceful, as though he had been waiting for this evening as patiently as she had. He ordered the same meal, thanked her, and spent most of dinner looking through the snow-covered streets instead of checking his phone. The executives who normally tried to reach him continued sending messages, but he ignored every notification without hesitation. Nearly an hour later, after finishing his coffee, Ethan folded his napkin carefully beside the empty cup. This time there was no envelope beneath the check. Instead, he stood, placed an ordinary 20% tip on the table, and waited quietly near the entrance until Claire completed serving her final guests. She untied her apron, hung it carefully inside the service station, and walked toward him. Ethan opened the restaurant door, allowing the cold evening air to flow inside for only a moment before they stepped onto the quiet sidewalk together. Without saying another word, he led her across the street toward a small neighborhood cafe that had already turned off its bright sign but still welcomed a handful of late customers. As they sat beside the window with 2 steaming cups of coffee between them, Ethan looked into Claire's eyes with a gratitude that seemed far older than either of them, took a slow breath, and finally said, 15 years ago, on the coldest night of my life, you saw a man that everyone else had stopped seeing. Claire remained perfectly still, her fingers wrapped around the warm coffee cup while the sounds of the cafe slowly faded into the background. 15 years. The number echoed in her mind, but no memory appeared. Ethan noticed the uncertainty in her expression and smiled gently. I did not expect you to remember, he said. The truth is, I hoped you never would. Outside the window, fresh snow continued covering the sidewalks where strangers hurried home beneath glowing holiday lights. Inside, only a few tables remained occupied, each conversation quiet enough to allow long pauses between Ethan's words. Back then, he began, I was 26 years old. I had just watched the company I spent 3 years building collapse in less than a month. Every investor walked away. My apartment was gone. My savings disappeared. I was too embarrassed to ask my family for help because I had promised them I would succeed. Claire listened without interrupting. She had served thousands of customers over the years, but she had never heard Ethan speak so openly. I spent days looking for work, he continued. One interview after another. Every answer was no. Eventually, I stopped shaving because I could not afford new razor blades. I stopped replacing worn shoes because I needed every dollar for bus fare. Pride becomes very expensive when you are running out of hope. He looked down at the steam rising from his coffee before continuing. One December evening, after another rejection, I walked into a small neighborhood diner. I counted the cash in my pocket 3 times before ordering the cheapest meal on the menu because it was all I believed I could afford. Claire searched her memory again. Countless faces had passed through restaurants where she had worked since college. Some stayed only minutes before disappearing forever. You were my waitress, Ethan said quietly. Only you were younger. Your hair was shorter, and you wore a green apron instead of a black one. Claire leaned forward slightly. A faint image began stirring somewhere in the back of her mind, but it remained blurred, like an old photograph left in sunlight for too many years. Ethan smiled at the memory. You welcomed every customer exactly the same way. Construction workers, teachers, elderly couples, families with children. Then me. I remember thinking you had no idea who I was, and somehow that made me feel human again. He laughed softly. When the meal arrived, I realized I had miscalculated sales tax. I was a few dollars short. It was not a fortune, maybe $6. But to me, it felt impossible. Claire's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Something about those words sounded familiar. Ethan continued before she could speak. I apologized and offered to wash dishes or come back the next morning with the money. I expected disappointment, maybe judgment. Instead, you simply smiled. He paused, his voice becoming even quieter. You told me that everyone deserves a warm meal on a cold night. Claire's breathing slowed. A forgotten winter evening. A tired young man sitting alone near the window. She could almost see it now, though the details were still hidden beneath years of ordinary days. Ethan looked at her with gratitude that had survived a decade and a half without fading. You reached into your own apron, paid the difference without letting anyone else notice, and then thanked me for choosing that little diner as if I had done you the favor. You never asked for my name. You never expected anything in return. You simply treated a stranger with dignity on the night he needed it most. Claire slowly lowered her eyes to the coffee in front of her. The reflection trembling across its surface seemed to pull an old memory back from somewhere she had not visited in years. She remembered the diner now. It had been called Maggie's Corner Cafe, a modest place outside Hartford where she had worked while finishing community college. Winters had always been busy because people came inside as much for warmth as for food. She remembered an exhausted young man sitting alone near the window, staring out at falling snow as though he had nowhere else to be. His coat had been clean but worn. His shoes had carried the white marks of dried road salt. He had thanked her every single time she refilled his coffee. "I remember someone," Claire whispered. "Not your name. Not your face exactly. Just the feeling that he looked completely defeated." Ethan smiled, and for the first time that evening, his eyes glistened with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "That was me." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment. $6, she said softly. "All of this, because of $6? Ethan shook his head. "No, not because of $6. Because of what happened after that." He leaned back in his chair, letting the memory unfold naturally. "When I stood to leave, I apologized again. I promised I would come back and repay you. Do you remember what you said?" Claire searched her memory before quietly answering, almost surprising herself. "I told him that if life ever became kind to him again, he could help someone else instead." Ethan nodded slowly. "Exactly." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Outside, snow continued falling across the quiet street, soft enough to erase footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. "You probably said those words 100 times to different people," Ethan continued. "But I carried them with me every single day. Whenever I wanted to quit, I remembered that a stranger believed I still deserved dignity even when I could not pay for dinner." Claire looked down, embarrassed by praise she did not feel she had earned. "I was only trying to be decent." "That is exactly the point," Ethan replied. "You thought it was ordinary. To me, it became extraordinary." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup before continuing. "A month later, an old colleague called with a consulting project. It was small, but it paid enough for me to rent a room. That project led to another, then another. Years passed. Eventually, I started over. The second company succeeded where the first had failed. Investors returned. Clients trusted me. The business grew beyond anything I imagined." Claire had read articles about Ethan Harrison's success countless times over the years, but hearing the story in his own quiet voice made every headline seem insignificant. As everything changed, Ethan said, "One thing never did. I kept thinking about the waitress who never made me feel poor. I hired private investigators more than once, but the diner had closed. Records disappeared. People moved away. Every lead ended with another unanswered question." He smiled again, this time with quiet satisfaction. "Then almost 2 years ago, I walked into Willow and Ash for a meeting. You brought me a glass of sparkling water before I even opened the menu. I recognized your smile immediately. 15 years had passed, but kindness has a remarkable memory. Mine never forgot yours." Claire sat in silence, overwhelmed not by the story itself, but by how carefully Ethan had carried it through the years. She had spent countless shifts serving strangers, believing every interaction ended the moment a customer walked out the door. Never once had she imagined that one ordinary evening could become part of someone else's life forever. "I wish I had remembered you," she said quietly. Ethan smiled with genuine warmth. "I am actually glad you did not." She looked at him with surprise. "Why?" He stirred his coffee slowly before answering. "Because if you had remembered me, you might have expected something in return. Instead, you proved that your kindness was never an investment. It was simply who you are." Claire lowered her eyes, humbled by the thought. Around them, the little cafe had grown quieter. One employee wiped the last empty tables while soft instrumental music drifted through the nearly empty room. Outside, the snowfall had become gentler, covering parked cars with a fresh white blanket that reflected the amber glow of the streetlights. Ethan reached inside his coat and carefully removed a weathered leather wallet. From one of its hidden compartments, he unfolded a small piece of paper that had clearly been opened and refolded hundreds of times. The edges were faded, and the ink had begun to soften with age. He placed it carefully on the table between them. Claire looked down in confusion. It was an old diner receipt. The total had been circled in blue ink, and beneath it, written in neat handwriting, were a few simple words. She recognized them immediately. "The next meal is on me. When life gets better, help someone else." Claire slowly covered her mouth with one hand. "I wrote this." Ethan nodded. "I kept it." She gently picked up the receipt, almost afraid it might fall apart in her hands. The handwriting belonged to a younger version of herself, written during busy shifts without ever imagining anyone would save it. "I found it in one of my old order books," she whispered. "Back then I used to leave little notes for people who looked like they needed encouragement." Ethan smiled. "Most people probably threw them away." "Probably. I never did." He looked out the window for a moment before continuing. "That receipt stayed in every office I ever worked in. It traveled with me through 4 company headquarters, 3 cities, and more business trips than I could possibly count. Whenever I felt discouraged or tempted to become someone I did not want to be, I read those words again." Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not because Ethan had become wealthy, but because something she barely remembered had become another person's quiet compass. "So the tips." She began softly. Ethan nodded before she could finish. "The first one was simply my way of saying thank you. The second was because I realized you still treated every customer exactly the same. The third came after I noticed you quietly sharing the money with the kitchen staff. After that, I understood something." Claire looked at him curiously. "What?" Ethan smiled with quiet admiration. "You still believe the note you wrote 15 years ago. You kept helping someone else, even when nobody was watching. The money was never changing you because your character had already decided who you were long before I walked back into your life." Claire carefully slid the faded receipt back across the table, but Ethan gently pushed it toward her again. "It belongs to you now," he said. She looked at the fragile piece of paper and slowly shook her head. "No," she answered softly. "It belongs to the man who carried it through 15 years of life. I think it found the right home a long time ago." Ethan smiled, unable to hide his admiration. Even now, after discovering the truth behind every generous tip, Claire was not thinking about what she could receive. She was thinking about what mattered most to someone else. It reminded him of the very reason he had searched for her in the first place. "There is something else I should tell you," Ethan said after a thoughtful pause. Claire looked up. "For almost 2 years, every tip I left had one purpose. I wanted to see whether success had changed you." Claire blinked in surprise. "Changed me?" "Yes." Ethan nodded. "The first night I recognized you, I could have introduced myself immediately. I could have told you everything. Instead, I decided to wait." He folded his hands together on the table. "Every Thursday, I watched carefully. I noticed that you treated every customer with the same respect. I noticed that you remembered birthdays, favorite meals, and even the names of children who came with their parents. I noticed you thanked the dishwasher at the end of every shift before you went home. Those are details most people never see." Claire smiled shyly. "Those things are just part of working with good people." "No," Ethan replied gently. "Those things are part of being a good person." He continued, "One evening I accidentally arrived early. Before the dining room opened, I saw you carrying grocery bags into the kitchen. I asked Daniel about them after you left. He told me you quietly bought groceries every month for an employee whose husband had lost his job. You never asked anyone for recognition." Claire looked slightly embarrassed. "She would have done the same for me." Ethan nodded. "Another week, I noticed one of my tips was smaller than usual because I had forgotten to update the amount before signing the receipt. The following Thursday, you thanked me exactly the same way you always had. No disappointment. No hesitation. That was the moment I understood the money had never mattered to you." Claire laughed softly. "Honestly, I never paid attention to the number until after you walked out the door." Ethan leaned back, his expression peaceful. "That is why I could finally tell you the truth. Gratitude should never become a burden. I wanted to be certain that I was thanking the same woman who helped a stranger on a snowy night without expecting applause, repayment, or even remembrance." Claire looked out the cafe window where fresh snow continued falling beneath the glow of the streetlights. "I still cannot believe something so small stayed with you all these years," she whispered. Ethan followed her gaze. "The world measures success by numbers. Revenue, investments, net worth. I learned a different measurement because of you. Sometimes a person's greatest contribution cannot be counted. It can only be carried in another person's heart. That is exactly what happened to me, and I have been trying to honor it ever since." Claire remained quiet for a long moment, watching the snow settle on the windowsill outside the cafe. She had spent years believing that kindness disappeared the moment it was given. Tonight she had learned that sometimes it continued traveling through another person's life long after both people had forgotten the moment itself. She looked back at Ethan with a gentle smile. "I cannot let you keep leaving those enormous tips," she said. "Now that I know why, It does not feel right anymore. Ethan did not seem surprised. In fact, he almost looked as though he had expected that answer from the beginning. I wondered when you would say that, he replied. Claire folded her hands around her coffee cup. You have already thanked me more than enough. If you keep doing it, eventually the gift becomes too heavy to carry. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Then tell me how to carry it differently. The question lingered between them. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced around the small cafe. A young barista was wiping down the espresso machine before closing. An older couple shared the last slice of apple pie while quietly laughing together. Ordinary people. Ordinary lives. She realized those were always the people she cared about most. Finally, she spoke. Do you remember what I wrote on that receipt? Ethan smiled. Help someone else. Exactly. Claire's eyes brightened with quiet conviction. If you truly want to honor that promise, then stop trying to repay me. Pass it forward the same way I hoped you would 15 years ago. Ethan leaned forward, listening carefully. What do you have in mind? Claire hesitated for only a moment. Restaurant workers rarely ask for help. Many work 2 jobs. Some postpone college because tuition is impossible. Others struggle to cover rent after a medical emergency or a family crisis. They keep showing up every day with a smile because that is part of the job. She looked down at the old receipt resting beside Ethan's coffee cup. Maybe someone should remind them that kindness belongs to them, too. Ethan's expression softened. A scholarship? Claire nodded. Scholarships. Emergency assistance. Maybe grants for hospitality workers who want to continue their education. Something that gives people options instead of temporary relief. Ethan remained silent for several seconds before a slow smile spread across his face. It was not the smile of a businessman closing another successful deal. It was the smile of someone finally understanding how gratitude could continue growing instead of ending. You know, he said quietly, I spent 2 years trying to decide how to repay one waitress. He looked directly into Claire's eyes. You just found a way to help thousands. Claire laughed softly and shook her head. Not me. Us. Ethan reached into his coat, not for another envelope this time, but for a small leather notebook. He opened a blank page and began writing as they talked, asking thoughtful questions about eligibility, financial planning, and how restaurant managers could recommend employees without embarrassing them. Nearly an hour passed before either of them noticed the cafe had officially closed. As they stepped back into the quiet Boston night, Ethan folded the notebook and smiled. Next Thursday, he said, I will still come to Willow and Ash. Claire raised an eyebrow playfully. With another impossible tip? Ethan shook his head. No, just dinner, good coffee, and 20% like everyone else. The rest of the gratitude has finally found somewhere much bigger to go. Spring arrived quietly in Boston, melting away the last traces of winter just as naturally as one chapter of life gave way to another. Every Thursday evening, Ethan Harrison still walked through the front doors of Willow and Ash at exactly 7:15 p.m. He still ordered grilled Atlantic salmon, roasted asparagus, sparkling water with lemon, and black coffee before leaving. The only visible difference was the receipt. The impossible tips had disappeared. In their place was a thoughtful 20%, accompanied by a sincere thank you and an easy smile that no longer carried the weight of an unpaid debt. The restaurant staff eventually stopped whispering about mysterious envelopes because there were none left to wonder about. Instead, they noticed something far more meaningful. Claire seemed lighter. Ethan seemed calmer. Whatever mystery had once existed between them had quietly become a friendship built on mutual respect rather than unanswered questions. 3 months later, invitations arrived for a small gathering inside the ballroom of a historic Boston library. There were no television cameras, no celebrity hosts, and no elaborate speeches. The audience consisted of restaurant owners, cooks, servers, dishwashers, culinary students, and hospitality workers from across New England. At the front of the room stood a simple banner bearing 5 words, the Helping Someone Else Foundation. Claire looked at it with disbelief. You changed the name, she whispered. Ethan smiled. I borrowed it from your note. That afternoon, the foundation announced its first scholarships, emergency assistance grants, and education programs for hospitality workers facing financial hardship. Every application would be reviewed anonymously so that dignity would never depend on someone's circumstances. Ethan insisted that Claire stand beside him during the announcement, but when the applause began, she quietly stepped back, allowing the recipients to occupy the center of the room instead. That decision surprised no one who truly knew her. Months turned into a year. One evening, a young waitress named Emily received a scholarship that allowed her to complete nursing school without leaving the restaurant that had supported her family for years. Another employee used an emergency grant to remain in his apartment after unexpected medical bills threatened his savings. None of them knew the entire story behind the foundation. They only knew that strangers had believed in them before they had the chance to give up on themselves. On another Thursday evening, Ethan returned to Willow and Ash as he always did. Claire placed his coffee on the table before he asked for it. "Your usual?" she said with a smile. "Always," Ethan replied. As she walked away to greet another customer, Ethan noticed she welcomed an elderly man dining alone with exactly the same warmth she offered every guest. Nothing about her had changed. She still remembered names. She still thanked every coworker before leaving. She still believed small acts of kindness mattered, even when nobody noticed. Ethan looked down at the receipt before signing it. The tip was ordinary. The gratitude never would be. As he left the restaurant, he paused outside for a moment, watching people hurry along the sidewalk beneath the evening lights. 15 years earlier, one waitress had quietly paid $6 for a discouraged stranger and written a simple sentence on the bottom of a receipt. She had forgotten the moment almost immediately. He never had, because in the end, money had never transformed his life. A single act of quiet dignity had done that. And sometimes the greatest legacy a person leaves behind is not measured by what they earn, but by the hope they awaken in someone who almost stopped believing.